Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal interesting details on Tuesday, July 29, 2025. First, Curtis had always believed that some truths, no matter how painful, needed to come to light. He had spent weeks, even months, balancing on the fragile edge between silence and integrity, torn between loyalty and love. Watching the carefully orchestrated wedding of Willow and Drew collapse before his eyes made Curtis feel both responsible and exposed. Willow's sudden departure from the altar, her dress billowing like a wave of grief down the aisle, marked the exact moment when Curtis realized the magnitude of what he had done. He had set in motion a chain of events that could not be stopped, and though he had hoped his intentions would lead to healing, the destruction was immediate and irreversible. For Curtis, this wasn't about revenge or morality. It was about protecting his own family, about trying to salvage his relationship with Portia before it completely disintegrated under the weight of secrets and buried regrets. Nina, standing paralyzed among the stunned guests, felt a tremor pass through her as if the earth beneath her had cracked open. She had fought so hard to preserve what little dignity remained in her bond with Willow. She had begged fate for a chance to make amends, to be a mother again, to be something more than a shadow in her daughter's life. And yet, despite everything, the moment Willow learned the truth, it was not Nina who revealed it, it was Curtis. That betrayal stung in ways she couldn't describe. She had lived with the knowledge of Drew's entanglement, unsure how to navigate its consequences without further alienating Willow. Nina's failure to act had become its own form of deceit. Watching her daughter flee from the man she was about to marry, Nina felt as though every step Willow took was another nail in the coffin of a second chance that might never come again. Curtis hadn't made his decision lightly. Every fiber of his being had screamed at him to stay out of it, to let the wedding proceed, to allow Drew and Willow their illusion of happiness. But he knew the damage hidden truths could inflict. The lies, the silence, the quiet erosion of trust that could rot a marriage from within. He had lived it with Portia. He had endured the slow unraveling of their foundation because neither of them had the courage to confront what truly mattered. This time, he vowed to be different. He had to show Portia, not just through words but through action, that he was willing to tear down any facade in order to build something honest. Telling Willow the truth wasn't an act of betrayal. It was an act of desperation to reclaim what he was on the verge of losing. When Curtis approached Nina to confess his role in the unraveling of the ceremony, he didn't expect forgiveness. He expected fire. But what he saw instead was something quieter, more dangerous, an eerie stillness in her eyes, a deepening shadow that suggested exhaustion rather than rage. Nina had poured so much of herself into trying to rebuild bridges already burned. Her fury flickered briefly, like a match that refused to catch flame, before extinguishing itself in the flood of resignation. Nina wasn't angry because Curtis had told the truth. She was angry because she hadn't. In that moment, she saw herself reflected in the worst possible light, not as a protector, not as a mother, but as a coward too afraid to speak when it mattered. As the guests dispersed and the church stood empty, Curtis remained behind, lingering in the silence like a man at a graveside. He had watched Willow's faith implode, watched Drew crumble in disbelief, and watched Nina spiral silently into a grief only she could understand. And yet, he felt strangely grounded. There was no satisfaction in what he had done, but there was a solemn clarity. Lies had haunted too many people in his life, and he refused to be complicit in another cycle of avoidance. If this pain was the price of truth, then so be it. For Curtis, truth was no longer negotiable, it was survival. It was the only way he knew how to love, flawed as it might be. Nina wandered the edge of the altar, touching the wilted flowers and overturned chairs as though searching for meaning in the wreckage. She thought of all the times she had chosen silence, all the times she believed that love meant shielding someone from pain. But love wasn't silence. It wasn't delay. It was timing and risk and the courage to tell the truth even when it wasn't convenient. Nina had failed Willow, not because she had done something cruel, but because she had done nothing at all. That realization was heavier than any accusation, and it left her shoulders hunched beneath an invisible burden she wasn't sure she'd ever be able to lift. Meanwhile, Willow, far from the church and the accusing gazes, stood alone in a haze of confusion and betrayal. The truth Curtis had given her was like glass, clear, sharp, and impossible to ignore. She had believed in Drew, in the idea that he was different from the others who had hurt her. But knowing he had hidden his past with Nina, allowed the wedding to proceed under false pretenses, made her question everything. Not just about him, but about herself. Had she been blind to the signs? Had she wanted so badly to build a family that she ignored the cracks in its foundation? She didn't know where to go next, only that she couldn't return to the woman who lied to her or the man who betrayed her. Her future, once so defined, was now a blur of broken trust and impossible questions. Curtis's apology to Nina, though quietly received, became the quiet turning point for them both. Nina, though still wounded, could now see that her anger wasn't with Curtis, but with herself. She didn't forgive him immediately, but she no longer saw him as the enemy. In her heart, she began to understand that honesty, even when brutal, was sometimes the only form of love that could survive. Curtis, for his part, returned home with a clearer sense of purpose. He would fight for Portia, not with empty promises, but by embodying the honesty he had once avoided. The fallout from the wedding was far from over, but within its ashes, something strange and undeniable began to stir. An uneasy hope that, perhaps, something more truthful could rise in place of everything that had been lost. Second, Martin never expected that an ordinary visit to Drew's house would lead him down a rabbit hole of forgotten lineage, veiled betrayals, and one of the most explosive secrets buried in the foundation of the Quartermain dynasty. He had been browsing through some paperwork Drew had left unattended, intending to help organize a few estate documents as a favor. What he found instead was a letter, aged, handwritten, and slipped between two legal folders as if someone had deliberately hidden it. The texture of the paper was delicate, and the cursive handwriting carried a haunting familiarity. As Martin began to read, each word unfolded with unsettling weight. The message within the letter hinted at a woman long presumed dead, a woman who now claimed to be the estranged sister of Monica, lost decades ago and forced into silence by circumstances never explained. What shook Martin to his core wasn't just the identity of the sender, but the calculated phrasing, the clear intention to return, to reclaim, and to disrupt everything Monica and the Quartermains had built. For several minutes, Martin sat alone in silence, the letter clutched tightly in his hand, his mind racing through legal scenarios, inheritance loopholes, and the devastating ripple effect this revelation could unleash. If the letter was genuine, and every detail suggested it was, then the implications were monumental. Monica's reputation, her status as the matriarch of the Quartermain family, her decisions regarding estate succession, charitable foundations, and even her guardianship over past heirs could all be called into question. The woman in the letter wasn't merely seeking reconciliation, she hinted at restitution, at long-denied justice, and perhaps a right to claim what she believed was taken from her. For Martin, this was more than just a legal anomaly. It was a bombshell, and its detonation could fracture a family already scarred by loss, betrayal, and internal power struggles. But rather than immediately alert Drew or Monica, Martin made a choice that would define him moving forward. He kept the letter secret. Martin justified his silence not with malice, but with caution. He told himself that revealing the truth prematurely could cause unnecessary harm, especially if the claims turned out to be false or exaggerated. But deeper than that lay a darker instinct, self-preservation. Martin had worked hard to build a career based on trust and discretion. If it came out that he had been the one to expose Monica's past and potentially shatter the fragile structure of the Quartermain family, he would not only alienate some of the most powerful people in Port Charles but risk becoming collateral damage in the chaos that would follow. So instead, he began a private investigation. Using discreet channels and old contacts, Martin searched public records, closed adoption cases, psychiatric hospital files, and property transactions tied to aliases that could match the woman's identity. He followed trails that led to dead ends, but eventually, patterns began to emerge: leases held under obscure names, bank accounts opened decades ago, medical files sealed under court order. The more he uncovered, the more Martin became convinced that this wasn't just a hoax. The woman who wrote the letter had gone to great lengths to cover her tracks. She had changed her name multiple times, appeared in different states, and at one point had even been treated for amnesia after a traumatic accident that eerily coincided with the timeline of her disappearance from Monica's life. What disturbed Martin most was her calculated patience. She had waited decades to come forward, and now, with Monica growing older and Drew gaining influence within the family, it seemed the perfect moment for her re-emergence. Martin feared that her silence all these years wasn't a sign of weakness but of strategy. If she chose to reveal herself publicly, she could challenge wills, overturn trusts, and drag Monica into a public scandal that would unravel not just personal legacies but financial empires built on the illusion of stability. Despite the emotional weight of the situation, Martin continued to interact with Drew as if nothing had changed. He advised him on corporate matters, asked casually about Monica's health, and observed silently as Drew grew closer to reclaiming a more active leadership role within the Quartermain estate. Drew, preoccupied with his own emotional wreckage following Willow's abrupt departure and the exposure of his past with Nina, didn't notice Martin's growing unease. Martin felt as though he were living a double life, balancing the daily mundanities of legal counsel while privately tracking the movements and aliases of a woman who could potentially bring down the very client he was sworn to protect. And with every step he took deeper into this mystery, the stakes grew higher. If he was discovered withholding this information, his reputation, license, and even his personal relationships could be destroyed in a matter of days. Martin's internal conflict intensified when he received a private investigator's report confirming that the woman in question had recently purchased a small home under a new identity just miles outside Port Charles. The timing was no coincidence. She was watching, waiting, perhaps even orchestrating the conditions of her return. Martin imagined her keeping tabs on Monica, on Drew, on ELQ's stock performance and hospital board decisions. She was not returning to reconnect. She was returning to reclaim. In the privacy of his office, Martin began drafting memos and legal frameworks, hypotheticals about how one might contest an estate claim or mount a legal defense for an adopted heir if a biological sibling emerged with proof of shared parentage. He worked long into the night, consumed not just by the logistics but by a mounting dread he couldn't shake. The truth was no longer just a secret. It was a storm on the horizon, and he was the only one who knew it was coming. The weight of his secrecy began affecting every corner of Martin's life. Diane noticed his distracted presence during dinners, his curt responses, the dark circles under his eyes. But Martin said nothing. Even to her, he could not confess. This wasn't just about a family scandal, it was about legacy, identity, and power. If the woman came forward, she could alter the very architecture of the Quartermain name, pulling Monica's past into the present like a ghost determined to rewrite history. And if Monica refused to acknowledge her, the case could turn into a national media circus, with legal challenges, DNA tests, and reputational warfare that no one in Port Charles was prepared for. Martin wanted to protect Monica, but the more he withheld, the more he felt like a traitor to the very people he was trying to shield. Now, as he looked once more at the letter, its yellowed paper worn at the edges, the ink slightly smudged where a tear might have fallen, Martin knew that his time was running out. The woman had given a clue in the final line, a date that was approaching fast, suggesting she would reveal herself by then. Martin had two choices. Tell Monica the truth and brace for the fallout, or continue the investigation alone and hope that the storm would pass without making landfall. But in his heart, he knew the truth couldn't be buried forever. Sooner or later, the door would open, and when it did, the entire Quartermain legacy would be forced to confront a sister they never knew they had, and a reckoning decades in the making. Third, the air between Albrecht and Jason was heavy with unresolved grief and the weight of unspoken questions as they stood in the dim light of the clinic hallway. Jason had come not seeking comfort, but clarity. For days, his mind had been haunted by the brief, fleeting glimpse of a woman at the airport, a woman whose walk, whose profile, whose presence echoed a ghost he had long since buried in memory. He had tried to rationalize it, tell himself it was merely someone who looked like Britt, a stranger wearing a similar coat, turning her head at just the right angle to mimic a face he once knew intimately. But as time passed, the doubt curdled into something more persistent, something urgent. He knew what he had seen. He knew her. That face, however brief, had awakened something visceral in him. So he came to Albrecht, not with proof, but with instinct, and when he spoke of the woman at the airport, he did so with a quiet conviction that struck through Albrecht's heart like a knife. Albrecht listened, at first skeptical, assuming Jason's grief had simply conjured a phantom from the past. But as he described the woman's mannerisms, the slight hesitation in her gait, the almost imperceptible scar near her right ear, Albrecht's dismissive resolve began to crumble. She wanted to deny it, to insist that Britt's death had been final and unambiguous. Yet something in Jason's voice made her falter. For years, she had lived with the belief that her daughter was truly gone, the victim of a tragic end that had not only robbed her of life but had left Albrecht with a hollow so deep it changed the way she breathed. But now that hollow stirred, filled not with hope, but with dread. Because if Jason was right, if Britt was alive, then everything Albrecht had believed about that night, about what she had been told and what she had seen, would have to be rewritten. It was then that Albrecht, caught between disbelief and dawning fear, did something she hadn't done in years. She opened the locked drawer of her memory and pulled out the truth she had buried. She told Jason everything. How the body had never been conclusively identified, how the WSB had intervened in Britt's case with suspicious haste, how certain files were sealed without explanation, and how her access to the body had been limited to a brief and heavily controlled encounter that left her with questions she never dared ask. At the time, she was too consumed by guilt, too overwhelmed by grief, and too beaten down by years of secrets and compromise to challenge what she had been told. But now, hearing Jason speak with the clarity of someone who had seen her daughter, truly seen her, Albrecht's entire world tilted. A fire reignited in her that she thought had died alongside Britt. Jason, though emotionally guarded as always, couldn't hide the way his heart had begun to race. If Britt was alive, then everything he had blamed himself for, all the regrets, all the chances not taken, might still be salvageable. But beyond personal redemption, this revelation carried a deeper urgency. If Britt had survived, it meant someone had gone to extreme lengths to make the world believe she was dead. That wasn't a mistake. That was a cover-up. And if someone had staged Britt's death, it was likely because she knew something dangerous enough to warrant erasure. Jason's instincts, sharpened by years of navigating the darkest corners of corruption, told him this wasn't a case of mistaken identity or a woman in hiding. This was bigger. Much bigger. And it meant Britt could be in danger even now. Together, Albrecht and Jason formed an uneasy alliance, united not by trust but by desperation. They began retracing every detail from the night Britt allegedly died, pulling hospital logs, transportation manifests, and sealed WSB files that had been gathering dust under layers of red tape and obfuscation. What they uncovered was a web of inconsistencies. Timestamps that didn't match, missing witness accounts, and personnel records tied to defunct WSB operations known for off-the-books experimentation and intelligence manipulation. Each revelation sharpened their suspicion that Britt hadn't died, but had been taken. Or worse, that she had agreed to disappear in exchange for something, perhaps coerced, perhaps to protect someone else. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that the lie had been orchestrated at a level far above either of them. Albrecht, who had spent years punishing herself for her failures as a mother, now found herself driven by something deeper than maternal instinct. It was fury. Fury that her daughter had been stolen from her not once, but twice, first by death, and now by deception. She began revisiting old contacts from her days in the WSB, pulling favors, cashing in debts, threatening those who thought they had buried their sins. Jason, ever methodical, began cross-referencing intelligence leaks with airport security footage, narrowing the potential movements of the woman he had seen. Though their styles clashed, Albrecht's emotional volatility versus Jason's ice-cold precision, their goal was identical: find Britt, no matter the cost. Even if it meant confronting allies who had turned into enemies, or unearthing truths they might never be able to silence again. As the days turned to weeks, their leads began to converge on a single name, a physician once connected to Britt's residency, long thought exiled after a malpractice scandal, but now resurfaced in private pharmaceutical development tied to WSB funding. His clinic, recently relocated to Eastern Europe, had all the hallmarks of a front. Albrecht and Jason knew it wouldn't be easy. Britt might be held there, or she might be complicit. Either way, answers were waiting, but so was danger. The return of Britt would shake not only their personal lives but the entire power balance in Port Charles. If she came back, she would come back with scars, emotional, psychological, and perhaps political.